A millionaire marries a virgin woman, and at the altar he says, "You will carry my heirs." She silently accepts, and that sentence etched in her the pain of a soulless marriage, but also awakened her strength. No one knew that beneath that white dress lay buried secrets and a hidden bloodline. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. The New York skyline glittered against the evening backdrop, a testament to human ambition and power. From the top floor of Blackwood Tower, Maxwell Blackwood observed the city below with calculated detachment. People moved like ants through the streets, insignificant yet necessary parts of the ecosystem he controlled. At 42, Maxwell had achieved what generations of Blackwoods had built toward: absolute financial dominance. "The quarterly reports, Mr. Blackwood." His assistant placed a leather folder on the desk and retreated quickly, knowing better than to disturb his contemplation. Maxwell didn't acknowledge her. His attention remained fixed on the cityscape as his mind processed the next strategic move. The Blackwood Financial Group controlled investments across 17 countries, owned 37 subsidiaries, and employed over 20,000 people. Yet despite this empire, his father's voice still echoed in his mind. "A legacy dies with its last heir, Maxwell." Those words had been burned into him since childhood. While other children played baseball or attended summer camps, young Maxwell spent his formative years in boardrooms, learning to read financial statements before bedtime stories. Emotions were inefficiencies, attachments were vulnerabilities. Love was a distraction that had no place in the Blackwood doctrine. His father, Elijah Blackwood, had shaped him with military precision: cold showers at dawn, 12-hour study, sessions, and public humiliation for any display of weakness. By the time Maxwell reached Harvard Business School, he was already more machine than man, executing decisions with ruthless efficiency and emotional detachment. "Sir, the board is waiting in the conference room." His assistant's voice came through the intercom, pulling him back to the present. Maxwell straightened his custom Armani suit and gathered his thoughts. Today was not about quarterly reports or market expansions. Today was about the future, specifically his legacy. At 42, the biological clock that he'd ignored for decades had suddenly become relevant. The Blackwood bloodline needed continuation. The boardroom fell silent as Maxwell entered. 12 members of the Blackwood Financial Group's executive committee sat around a mahogany table that had witnessed generations of company decisions. These men and women were among the most powerful in the financial world, yet they deferred to Maxwell with a mixture of respect and fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Maxwell began, his voice carrying the subtle Boston accent of old money, "I've gathered you today to discuss a matter of strategic importance. As you know, the Blackwood legacy spans over a century of financial excellence. To ensure its continuation, I've decided it's time to secure the next generation." Subtle glances were exchanged around the table. This was unprecedented. Maxwell Blackwood, notorious for his detachment from personal matters, was discussing family planning in a board meeting. "I'll be seeking a suitable wife within the next quarter. The candidate should embody the qualities that align with our corporate values: discipline, intelligence, and adaptability. I've prepared a shortlist based on extensive background checks and genetic compatibility assessments." He distributed folders containing profiles of potential candidates, daughters of political figures, executives of partner companies, and European aristocrats. The board members reviewed them with the same clinical approach they would use for potential acquisitions. "Sir," ventured Catherine Montgomery, the only board member who had known Maxwell since childhood, "if I may, marriage typically involves emotional compatibility as well." Maxwell's grey eyes met hers with a coldness that made her regret speaking. "Emotions are inefficient, Catherine. My father married my mother because she had the genetic profile to produce a suitable heir and the temperament to raise one according to Blackwood standards. Their marriage was a successful business arrangement, as mine will be." The meeting continued with discussions about prenuptial agreements and public relations strategies for the upcoming marriage. As executives filed out, James Harrison, Maxwell's cousin and the company's head of risk assessment, lingered behind. "An impressive strategy, as always," James said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "But I'm curious, have you considered candidates beyond our usual circles? Perhaps someone unexpected might bring fresh perspectives to the Blackwood lineage." Maxwell regarded his cousin with measured interest. James had always been the more personable of the Blackwood men, with his charismatic demeanor and seemingly genuine interest in people. Some might mistake it for warmth, but Maxwell recognized it as simply a different style of calculation. "I'm open to suggestions, provided they meet our standards," Maxwell replied. James's smile widened. "Actually, I recently encountered someone fascinating at the Riverside Community Hospital fundraiser, a young woman named Grace Sullivan. She works in their pediatric ward, a nurse with remarkable character. Not our usual choice, but perhaps that's precisely why she's worth considering." Maxwell's expression remained impassive, but his mind worked quickly. A nurse was certainly not the pedigree he had envisioned, but there was strategic value in considering candidates outside their immediate circle. Public perception was increasingly important in today's market, and marrying someone with a caring profession could soften the Blackwood image. "Send me her file," Maxwell said finally. 2 weeks later, Maxwell found himself at the Riverside Community Hospital Charity Gala. He rarely attended such events, preferring to make anonymous donations that required no social interaction, but tonight had a purpose. Grace Sullivan entered the ballroom, wearing a simple blue dress that stood out among the designer gowns like a wildflower in a cultivated garden. At 28, she moved with a quiet confidence that came not from wealth or status, but from purpose. Her auburn hair was gathered in a simple updo, and unlike the heavily made-up socialites, her face bore only minimal cosmetics that highlighted her natural features. Maxwell observed her from across the room. She spent most of the evening talking to patients and their families, rather than networking with potential donors. When she laughed, it was genuine, a sound untainted by social calculation. Something about her authenticity made her both fascinating and alien to Maxwell. "Mr. Blackwood, I don't believe we've been introduced," came a voice from behind him. Maxwell turned to find himself face to face with Dr. Robert Sullivan, Grace's father and the hospital's chief of pediatrics. "I wanted to personally thank you for your generous donation to our children's wing. It was a sound investment in community health," Maxwell replied mechanically. Dr. Sullivan studied him with keen eyes that had diagnosed countless patients. "Most of our benefactors call it charity, Mr. Blackwood. You're refreshingly honest about seeing it as an investment." "Dishonesty is inefficient." "Indeed." Dr. Sullivan nodded toward Grace, who was helping an elderly patient to her seat. "My daughter believes in honest work as well, though perhaps with a different philosophy behind it. She sees value in people beyond their utility." Maxwell found himself watching Grace with increasing interest. There was something both foreign and compelling about the way she interacted with the world, a genuine care for others that the Blackwood philosophy would consider wasteful sentimentality. By the end of the evening, Maxwell had made his decision. Grace Sullivan would become the next Mrs. Blackwood, not because she fit the profile he had originally envisioned, but because she represented something his empire lacked: humanity. Perhaps this quality, which his father had deemed a weakness, might prove strategically valuable in ways the old man had never considered. What Maxwell couldn't have predicted was how this decision would begin to unravel the carefully constructed world he had inherited. The machinery of his plan was set in motion that night, but unlike the financial markets he had mastered, human hearts followed no predictable algorithm. Grace Sullivan had spent her entire life embracing simplicity. Growing up in a modest home in Providence, Rhode Island, she was raised on her mother's homemade meals and her father's unwavering moral principles. Their small house had always been filled with laughter, heated debates about ethics, and the occasional patient her father would bring home for Sunday dinner when they had nowhere else to go. While money was often tight, especially after her, Mother's long illness drained their savings. The Sullivan household was rich in compassion. So when Maxwell Blackwood's black Bentley appeared outside the hospital where she worked, Grace assumed he was there for another publicity opportunity. Their conversation at the charity gala had been brief but memorable, mainly because of how different he seemed from anyone she'd ever met. His eyes held none of the warmth or uncertainty that characterized most human interactions. Instead, they calculated, measured, and assessed with mechanical precision. "Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you," the driver announced, holding the car door open. Grace hesitated. "I don't recall scheduling a meeting." "He said it's regarding a personal matter of mutual benefit." Curiosity overrode caution, and 20 minutes later, Grace found herself seated across from Maxwell in an exclusive restaurant overlooking Boston Harbor. The establishment had been cleared of other patrons, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the subtle movements of discreet waitstaff. "You must value your privacy," Grace commented, taking in the empty tables. "I value efficiency," Maxwell replied. "Other diners create unnecessary variables in our conversation." Grace suppressed a smile. "Human interaction isn't a mathematical equation, Mr. Blackwood." "All interactions can be optimized, Miss Sullivan." Maxwell's expression remained unchanged as he placed a small velvet box on the table between them. "Which brings me to the purpose of our meeting." When he opened the box to reveal a diamond ring large enough to fund the hospital's pediatric ward for a year, Grace's first response was laughter. It bubbled up unexpectedly, genuine and unrestrained. Maxwell's eyebrows drew together in rare confusion. "You find my proposal humorous?" "I find it absurd," Grace replied, regaining her composure. "We've spoken exactly once before today. You know nothing about me." "I know everything relevant," Maxwell countered, sliding a folder across the table. "Your educational background, medical history, psychological profile, family financial situation, and social connections. You're competent, healthy, resilient, and possess genetic traits that complement mine." Grace stared at the folder in disbelief. "You investigated me." "Due diligence. Your father's medical practice is respected but financially strained. He's carrying $437,000 in debt from your mother's cancer treatments and your student loans. The hospital where you work is undergoing budget cuts that will affect your department first. Meanwhile, you've been sending application letters to international medical missions." His words struck with precision. Her father had been working double shifts to manage the debt, refusing to let it affect his standard of care. The hospital. Rumors about budget cuts had only started circulating yesterday. "You've made your point about knowing my circumstances," Grace said quietly, "but that doesn't explain why someone like you would propose to someone like me." Maxwell leaned forward, his posture impeccable. "I require a wife who will uphold certain standards and eventually provide heirs to the Blackwood legacy. Your genetic profile, ethical reputation, and caregiving abilities make you suitable. In exchange, your family's debts will be erased, and your father's medical center will receive funding sufficient to expand his research. Additionally, I'll establish a foundation in your name for whatever medical causes you deem worthy." Grace sat back, momentarily speechless. The offer was simultaneously generous and cold-blooded, a business proposition disguised as marriage. Yet she couldn't help thinking about her father, who had sacrificed everything for his patients and family, or the children at her ward who needed resources the hospital couldn't provide. What would this marriage actually entail, she asked finally. A prenuptial agreement outlining mutual expectations. You would reside at Blackwood Estate, attend required social functions, maintain appropriate public appearance, and eventually bear children. In return, you would have financial security and significant charitable influence. And love, companionship, partnership, Grace challenged. Something flickered in Maxwell's eyes. Perhaps annoyance, perhaps curiosity. Those are subjective concepts with variable definitions. I can promise respect and commitment to our agreement. Grace shook her head slowly. I should be insulted by this proposal. Yet you haven't refused, Maxwell observed. She hadn't. Despite the clinical nature of his offer, something held her attention. Perhaps it was the thought of her father, finally, free from debt, or the children she could help with Blackwood resources. Or perhaps buried beneath her indignation was a naive belief that someone capable of such calculation might still possess a heart worth uncovering. I'll consider it, she said finally, but I have conditions of my own. 3 weeks later, Grace stood in a private dressing room at St. Thomas Cathedral, surrounded by fabrics worth more than her yearly salary. The engagement had been announced in major newspapers, creating a media frenzy around the unlikely pairing. "Beauty and the Billionaire," one headline read. "Blackwood Empire finds its heart," declared another. Her father entered the room, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. "You still have time to change." "Your mind, Gracie." "Dad, we've discussed this. The foundation will fund treatments for hundreds of children. Your research can continue without financial pressure. It's worth it." Dr. Sullivan took her hands in his. "No amount of good you can do for others is worth sacrificing your own happiness." "Who says I'm sacrificing anything?" Grace attempted. A smile. "Maybe I'll be the one to crack the infamous Blackwood shell." He studied her face with the same careful attention he gave his patients. "Just remember, sweetheart, you can't heal someone who doesn't believe they're wounded." The ceremony itself was a masterclass in orchestrated perfection. Every detail had been arranged according to Maxwell's precise instructions. The guest list included political figures, business leaders, and carefully selected media representatives. Grace's side was sparsely populated: her father, a few colleagues from the hospital, and her childhood friend Megan, who kept shooting worried glances her way. When the moment came for their vows, Maxwell delivered his with the same efficiency that characterized all his actions. His words were appropriate, even elegant, but devoid of emotion. When it was Grace's turn, she went off script, looking directly into his eyes. "I promise to honor our agreement," she said clearly, "but I also promise to look for the person behind the persona, to seek truth even when it's uncomfortable, and to believe in the possibility that this union might become more than what's written in our contract." A subtle ripple of whispers moved through the cathedral. Maxwell's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, but he completed the ceremony without comment. It wasn't until they stood at the altar for the final pronouncement that he leaned close to her ear and whispered the words that would soon dominate headlines across the country. "You will carry my heirs." The words sent an involuntary chill through Grace, not because of their content but because of the absolute certainty in his tone. As camera flashes erupted around them, she realized that despite all her preparations and conditions, she had entered a world governed by rules she hadn't yet begun to understand. Blackwood Estate sprawled across 50 acres of Massachusetts countryside, a neo-Gothic mansion surrounded by manicured gardens and security perimeters. When the limousine passed through the intricate iron gates, Grace felt as though she was entering another realm, one where the normal laws of humanity were suspended. "Your living quarters are in the East Wing," Maxwell informed her as they entered the cavernous main hall. "Mrs. Winters, the head housekeeper, will acquaint you with the staff and household protocols. I've scheduled a meeting for us tomorrow morning to discuss your public appearances for the next month." With that, he turned to leave. "That's it?" Grace called after him. "We've been married for less than 6 hours." Maxwell paused. "Did you expect something different?" Most couples spend their wedding night together. "For sentimental or procreational purposes," he noted clinically. "The former is unnecessary, and the latter will be scheduled at the optimal time according to your fertility cycle. Good evening, Mrs. Blackwood." As his footsteps faded down the corridor, Grace stood alone in the massive entrance hall, surrounded by portraits of stern-faced Blackwood ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to follow her, judging the outsider who had entered their domain. Ever the first time since accepting Maxwell's proposal, doubt crept into her heart. What had she truly gotten herself into? Life at Blackwood Estate unfolded with clockwork precision. Each morning, Grace awoke to find a detailed itinerary placed on her nightstand, a meticulous schedule that outlined her expected activities, appropriate attire, and approved talking points for any public appearances. The household staff moved through the mansion like ghosts, appearing when needed and vanishing just as quickly, their eyes always downcast, their responses rehearsed. After 3 weeks, Grace had memorized the unwritten rules that governed this gilded prison. Never enter Maxwell's study without an appointment. Never question financial matters in front of others. Never deviate from approved conversation topics at social functions. Most importantly, never show emotion when cameras or business associates were present. On her fourth Tuesday as Mrs. Blackwood, Grace received a thick envelope containing her personal development program. Inside was a contract stipulating educational courses, fitness regimens, nutrition plans, and medical evaluations, all designed to prepare her body and mind for the role of bearing the Blackwood heir. "This is absurd," Grace declared, storming into Maxwell's study without knocking, breaking. "Rule number 1. I'm not some broodmare you can condition for optimal breeding." Maxwell looked up from his computer, his expression betraying only mild irritation at the interruption. The program was developed by leading experts in prenatal health and child development. It's based on scientific evidence. The program also states I need written approval to visit my father, that my friends must undergo background checks before visiting, and that my personal communications will be monitored for security purposes. She dropped the contract on his desk. "These aren't health measures. They're control mechanisms. They're necessary precautions. The Blackwood name attracts threats, opportunists, and media scrutiny. Your previous life didn't prepare you for these realities." Grace crossed her arms. "And what about the hidden clause on page 17, the one requiring me to conceive within 12 months or face financial penalties?" A flicker of surprise crossed Maxwell's face. Perhaps he hadn't expected her to read the fine print so carefully. "It's a standard contingency. All business arrangements include performance metrics." "This isn't a business arrangement. It's supposed to be a marriage." "It's both," Maxwell replied, rising from his chair. Even in this moment of confrontation, his posture remained impeccable, his voice measured. "You agreed to certain terms when you accepted my proposal. The foundation for your pediatric research has already been established. Your father's debts have been cleared. You've received your end of the bargain." Grace felt her anger giving way to a deeper emotion, sadness for the man standing before her, so disconnected from his own humanity that he could reduce life's most intimate relationships to contractual obligations. "Did anyone ever hold you?" she asked quietly. "When you were a child, did anyone ever just hold you because you needed comfort, not because you'd achieved something or met some expectation?" The question hung in the air between them. For a brief moment, something vulnerable flickered across Maxwell's face, so quickly Grace might have imagined it. Then his expression hardened once more. "Emotional indulgence is a luxury the Blackwood heir cannot afford. My father understood this. His father before him understood this. The family legacy depends on discipline, not sentiment." "And what a lonely legacy it is," Grace observed, turning to leave. At the door, she paused. "I'll follow your program, Maxwell, but not because of your contract. I'll do it because someday there might be a child who deserves better than the childhood you had." The encounter left Maxwell uncharacteristically unsettled. That evening, he retreated to his private study and poured himself a rare glass of scotch. His gaze fell on the portrait of Elijah Blackwood that dominated the wall, a stern figure whose approval Maxwell had spent a lifetime seeking and never quite attaining. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Mrs. Winters, the elderly housekeeper who had served the Blackwood family for over 40 years, entered with a silver tray. "You missed dinner, Mr. Blackwood. I've brought you something." "Thank you, Mrs. Winters, but I'm not hungry." The old woman set down the tray anyway. "Your father used to say the same thing when he was troubled. He didn't eat then either." Maxwell gave her a sharp look. Mrs. Winters was the only staff member who occasionally spoke to him as something other than an employer, a liberty granted by her decades of service. "Mrs. Blackwood is not what I expected," he admitted. Mrs. Winters' weathered face remained impassive, but her eyes held a knowing look. "She reminds me of someone." "Who?" "Your mother before." She stopped herself, busying her hands with arranging the silverware. "Well, that was long ago." Maxwell frowned. His mother was rarely mentioned in the household. Her departure when he was 7 had been treated as a business matter, explained to him as an incompatibility with the Blackwood standards. He'd been told she'd returned to her family in Europe, though he'd never received so much as a letter. "My mother was weak," he said finally, repeating the assessment his father had drilled into him. "She couldn't handle the responsibilities of her position." Mrs. Winter's lips tightened slightly. "Is that what you were told?" Before Maxwell could question her further, the intercom buzzed. James Harrison was requesting entry at the main gate. Maxwell dismissed Mrs. Winters and composed himself, pushing away the unsettling conversation. James arrived bearing news and champagne, his charismatic presence filling the somber study with unwelcome energy. "Congratulations are in order, cousin. The market responded magnificently to your marriage. Blackwood stocks are up 12%. "Public sentiment is fickle," Maxwell replied, accepting a glass. "Today's approval can become tomorrow's criticism, which is why we need to capitalize on the moment." James settled into a leather chair, his casual demeanor a stark contrast to Maxwell's rigidity. "The board is impressed with your choice of bride. She's a hit with the public, the nurse with a heart of gold who tamed the financial wolf. The timing is perfect for our expansion into healthcare technologies." Maxwell nodded. The strategic advantages of his marriage were unfolding as planned, yet he found himself strangely reluctant to discuss Grace in these terms. "Is something troubling you?" James asked, his tone concerned but his eyes watchful. "You don't seem quite yourself." "I'm perfectly fine." "Of course." James smiled, swirling his champagne. "Though I must admit, I'm curious about how the new Mrs. Blackwood is adjusting. The transition must be challenging for someone from her background." "She's adaptable." "I'm glad to hear it. The prenuptial agreement is quite demanding after all, especially that 12-month conception clause." James's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A shame if something happened to prevent its fulfillment. The contingencies would transfer significant control to the closest male relative. Me, as it happens." Maxwell regarded his cousin carefully. "The contingency exists to ensure the Blackwood legacy continues, not as a power transfer mechanism." Of course, James stood, straightening his Italian suit. "Just an observation between family members. Speaking of family, I should pay my respects to your bride. Where might I find her?" "She's resting." Maxwell's tone made it clear. The subject was closed. "I'll convey your regards." After James departed, Maxwell returned to his desk, unable to shake a growing sense of disquiet. He opened his laptop and typed a command, bringing up the security feed from Grace's wing of the mansion. She sat by her window, writing in a journal, her face illuminated by the soft lamplight. The sight of her quiet dignity stirred something unfamiliar in him, an uncomfortable awareness that she was not merely an asset to be managed, but a human being with her own inner world. He closed the feed, troubled by his own intrusion. Meanwhile, Grace was documenting her observations about life within the Blackwood Empire. Her journal had become both confidant and safety valve, a place to process the strangeness of her new existence. Tonight she was writing about the household staff and their curious behavior, how they seemed to operate in a state of constant vigilance, as though one misstep might lead to disaster. A soft knock interrupted her writing. When she opened the door, Mrs. Winters stood there, her usual stoic expression replaced by one of veiled concern. "Pardon the intrusion, Mrs. Blackwood. I brought you some chamomile tea." Grace smiled, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, Mrs. Winters. Would you like to join me? I could use the company." The old housekeeper hesitated, glancing down the hallway before entering. She perched tensely on the edge of a chair, her gnarled hands folded in her lap. "You're not like the others," Mrs. Winters observed quietly. "Others?" "The women Mr. Blackwood has brought here. The potential matches his father arranged interviews with after his Harvard graduation, the socialites who visited for weekend hunting parties." Her voice lowered further. "You ask questions. You notice things?" Grace set down her tea. "What sorts of things should I be noticing, Mrs. Winters?" The housekeeper's face closed like a shutter. "I've said too much already. Just be careful, especially around Mr. Harrison. He has his father's eyes, the kind that see opportunities in other people's misfortunes." Before Grace could press further, Mrs. Winters stood abruptly. "I should return to my duties. And Mrs. Blackwood?" She paused at the door. The East Wing storage rooms contain the household records dating back 3 generations. Mr. Blackwood never visits that section. The keys are kept in the butler's pantry. With that cryptic suggestion, she departed, leaving Grace with more questions than answers. Why would the loyal housekeeper direct her toward apparently restricted information? What secrets could be hidden in mundane household records? 2 days later, when Maxwell was in New York for meetings, Grace found herself standing in the dusty East Wing corridor. Using the key she'd borrowed from the butler's pantry, she unlocked a room filled with neatly organized records of the Blackwood household's operations. Ledgers, staff records, maintenance logs, the meticulous documentation of a family obsessed with control. She was about to leave when a smaller door at the back of the room caught her attention. It required a different key, one she didn't have. Remembering a trick her father had taught her from his hospital days, she used a hairpin to manipulate the simple lock. Inside was a smaller room containing older records, leather-bound volumes, dating back to the early days of Blackwood Estate. Grace ran her fingers over the spines, wondering what she was looking for. A volume labeled Household Staff 1988-1995 caught her eye, the years encompassing her own birth and early childhood. As she flipped through the pages, a familiar name leaped out at her. Sullivan, Margaret. According to the record, Margaret Sullivan had worked as a nurse for the Blackwood family from 1992 to 1994, caring for Maxwell's ailing father during a private health crisis. Her employment had been terminated abruptly, with a notation, contract violation, non-disclosure agreement enforced. Grace stared at the entry in confusion. Margaret Sullivan was her mother's name, but her mother had been a hospital nurse in Providence, not a private nurse for the Blackwoods. And the dates couldn't be right. Grace herself had been born in 1994, the year this Margaret Sullivan had left Blackwood employment. Unless... The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside sent her heart racing. Grace quickly replaced the ledger and slipped out of the room, locking both doors behind her. She rounded the corner just as James Harrison appeared at the other end of the hallway. "Mrs. Blackwood," he called, his smile pleasant, but his eyes calculating. "What a surprise to find you in this forgotten corner of the estate." "I was exploring," Grace replied, keeping her voice steady. "This house has so many mysteries." "Indeed it does." James approached, his manner cordial but somehow threatening. "Some mysteries are better left unexplored, though, for everyone's benefit." As he escorted her back to the main part of the house, his hand on her elbow just a fraction too tight, Grace knew with certainty that she had stumbled onto something significant. The question was, what did it mean for her, for Maxwell, and for the future they were supposedly building together? Grace couldn't sleep. The discovery in the East Wing records had unleashed a torrent of questions. Was it merely coincidence that a woman sharing her mother's name had worked for the Blackwoods? Providence wasn't far from the Blackwood estate. Perhaps her mother had indeed worked there briefly before Grace was born. But why had her father never mentioned it? At breakfast, she casually brought up her exploration of the house. "The East Wing has some fascinating historical records," she mentioned, watching Maxwell's reaction over her coffee cup. He barely glanced up from his tablet. "Most of them are mundane household accounts, nothing of interest. I noticed some staff records from the 1990s. There was a nurse named Margaret Sullivan employed here. Any relation to your family's history?" Maxwell's hand paused imperceptibly before continuing to scroll through his emails. "Staff come and go. I don't recall every employee. She would have been here when you were about 11, caring for your father during an illness." This time Maxwell did look up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You seem unusually interested in irrelevant historical details. Just trying to understand the household I've married into." The conversation might have continued, but Maxwell's phone rang, a call he clearly had been expecting. He excused himself, and Grace was left to ponder. His subtle reaction. He hadn't seemed shocked by the name, but there had been something. A momentary tension that suggested the information wasn't as irrelevant as he claimed. That afternoon, Grace called her father from her private line, one she suspected was monitored, despite assurances to the contrary. "Dad, I need to ask you something," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Did Mom ever work for the Blackwood family before I was born?" The silence that followed lasted several seconds too long. "Where did this question come from, Gracie?" "Her," father's voice sounded strained. "I found some old employment records here. There was a Margaret Sullivan listed as a private nurse in the early 90s. Another pause. "Your mother took some private nursing jobs when we were struggling financially. I don't recall all her patients." "Dad." Grace's grip tightened on the phone. "You remember every patient you've ever treated. You wouldn't forget. If Mom worked for one of the wealthiest families in Massachusetts..." Dr. Sullivan sighed heavily. "This isn't a conversation we should have over the phone. I'll visit you this weekend." "The contract says you need prior approval to visit." "Then? Get approval. This is important, Grace." The urgency in her father's voice only deepened her unease. After hanging up, Grace sent a formal request through the proper channels for her father's visit. The approval came back surprisingly quickly, with a note that Maxwell himself would be away on business that weekend, but her father was welcome to stay overnight. 2 days later, with Maxwell in Tokyo for negotiations, Grace waited anxiously in the estate's formal receiving room. When Dr. Sullivan finally arrived, she was shocked by his appearance. Her father had always been robust despite his age, but now he looked diminished, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy that was entirely unlike him. "Let's walk in the gardens," he suggested after a stilted greeting. "The fresh air will do us good." Once they were outside, following a gravel path through the meticulously landscaped grounds, Dr. Sullivan spoke in low tones. "What I'm about to tell, you should have been shared years ago, but your mother and I made a decision to protect you." Grace's heart pounded. "Protect me from what?" "Not what. Who?" Her father's eyes scanned the gardens as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Yes, your mother worked here at Blackwood Estate in 1993 and 1994. Elijah Blackwood, Maxwell's father, had suffered a stroke that was kept from the public. Margaret was hired to provide his rehabilitation care. Why keep that a secret? Dr. Sullivan's face tightened with old pain, because during those months, Elijah Blackwood developed an inappropriate interest in your mother. He was a powerful man used to taking what he wanted. When she rejected his advances, he became vindictive. She was fired without reference, and we were threatened with legal action if she ever spoke about her time here. Grace struggled to process this information. "That's horrible, but why hide it from me all these years?" Her father's steps slowed, and he took her hands in his. "Because there's more to the story, Gracie. Your mother discovered she was pregnant shortly after leaving Blackwood employment." The world seemed to tilt beneath Grace's feet. "Are you saying..." "No," Dr. Sullivan interrupted quickly. "I am your father in every way that matters. We married quickly when we found out about the pregnancy, and I've never regretted it for a moment. I loved your mother from the first day we met at nursing school, and I loved you from the moment I first held you." Grace felt her throat constrict. "But biologically?" Her father's eyes filled with tears. "We always planned to tell you when. You were older, then your mother became ill, and afterward, it never seemed like the right time. The truth is complicated, Grace. Margaret was assaulted by Elijah Blackwood. What happened wasn't consensual." Grace felt physically ill. "Does Maxwell know?" "I don't believe so. Elijah Blackwood paid a substantial settlement with strict non-disclosure agreements. The money helped pay for your education, though we never told you its source. They had reached a stone bench partially hidden by ornamental hedges." Grace sank onto it, her mind reeling. "So I'm actually a Blackwood, Maxwell's half-sister." The grotesque implications of her marriage threatened to overwhelm her. "No," her father said firmly. "DNA tests confirmed you aren't Elijah's biological child." "I don't understand." Dr. Sullivan lowered his voice further. "Your mother confided that she had developed feelings for someone else in the household, a brief relationship. When Elijah discovered it, his rage was terrible. He used the relationship as leverage to force your mother to leave quietly, threatening to destroy the other person's life as well." "Who was it?" Grace whispered. "She never told me the man's name. She felt it would protect both him and you. If no one knew, all she ever said was that he was kind to her when kindness was rare in this house." Grace's mind raced through possibilities. James Harrison? Her father shook his head. I don't know, but whoever he was, your mother believed he had no knowledge of her pregnancy. She wanted it that way. As they continued walking, Grace struggled to absorb these revelations. Her entire identity had been built on a foundation of half-truths. The marriage that had seemed merely cold and transactional now took on potentially sinister dimensions. Why are you telling me this now? She finally asked. Because when you called about finding those records, Dr. Sullivan's voice broke. Grace, I fear your marriage wasn't coincidental. James Harrison approached you specifically at that hospital fundraiser, didn't he? He suggested you to Maxwell? Grace nodded slowly, memories rearranging themselves like pieces of a puzzle. You think James knew about my mother? That he orchestrated this marriage? I think nothing happens in the Blackwood world by chance. The prenuptial agreement, the inheritance contingencies, it all feels calculated. What if someone discovered your connection to this family and is using you as part of some larger scheme? They had circled back toward the main house. Grace noticed a security camera tracking their movement and wondered if their conversation had been monitored, despite the garden's ambient noise. I need to know the truth, she said firmly. All of it. Be careful, her father warned. The Blackwoods have destroyed people for less than what you're contemplating. If Maxwell doesn't know about this history, revealing it could have unpredictable consequences. That night, after her father departed, Grace lay awake in her ornate bedroom, feeling more isolated than ever. Her thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock. When she opened the door, Mrs. Winters stood there, her weathered face grave. Mrs. Blackwood, I couldn't help noticing Dr. Sullivan's visit seemed to trouble you. Grace studied the elderly housekeeper. Mrs. Winters, how long have you worked for the Blackwood family? 47 years this October. Then you would have been here in 1994 when a nurse named Margaret Sullivan worked here. Mrs. Winters' expression remained carefully neutral. I remember many staff members from over the years. This one was different, Grace pressed. She left under difficult circumstances. She was my mother. The old woman's composure finally cracked, her eyes widening in genuine shock. You're Margaret's daughter. But that would mean... She stopped herself, glancing nervously down the hallway. It would mean what, Mrs. Winters? After a moment of internal struggle, the housekeeper stepped inside and closed the door. It was a dark time in this household. The old Mr. Blackwood was a cruel man even before his stroke. The illness made him worse, paranoid, vindictive. Your mother was kind to everyone, even those most overlooked. Including Maxwell? Mrs. Winters nodded slowly. The boy was 11, practically abandoned. His mother had been gone for years. His father alternated between ignoring him and subjecting him to impossible expectations. Margaret was the only one who showed him basic human kindness. Grace felt a chill. And James Harrison? Was he here then too? James lived with his parents in the city, but visited often. He was 16, already showing the ambition that would define him. Always watching, that one. Always calculating. Did he know about my mother's situation when she left? Mrs. Winters' hands trembled slightly. Mr. Harrison knows more than he should about many things. He has a talent for discovering secrets and storing them away like weapons. One more question. Grace took a deep breath. Do you know who my biological father is? The housekeeper's expression became unreadable. Some secrets aren't mine to reveal, Mrs. Blackwood, but I will say this. Blood has a way of finding blood, even when we don't recognize it. After Mrs. Winters left, Grace sat by her window, watching the moonlight cast long shadows across the immaculate grounds. In the morning, she would face Maxwell upon his return from Tokyo, a man who might be her half-brother, her step-brother, or perhaps something else entirely. The thought filled her with dread and determination in equal measure. Meanwhile, in his Tokyo hotel suite, Maxwell disconnected from a video call with James Harrison, who had just shared some troubling information about Dr. Sullivan's visit to the estate. For the first time in his adult life, Maxwell felt something akin to panic. The carefully constructed narrative of his family history, the foundation upon which he had built his identity, was being challenged by unexpected connections. He picked up his secure phone and dialed a number he rarely used. "It's Blackwood," he said when the line connected. "I need everything you have on Margaret Sullivan, employed at Blackwood Estate in 1994, and her daughter Grace Sullivan Blackwood. Medical records, DNA profiles, everything. This is priority level 1. As he hung up, Maxwell caught his reflection in the window. The perfect Blackwood heir, trained from birth to control every variable. But now, for the first time, he faced variables he hadn't accounted for. And somewhere deep in his psyche, in a place he had learned to ignore since childhood, a memory stirred. A kind nurse who had once treated his wounds, both physical and emotional, after one of his father's disciplinary sessions. A woman who had told him just before she disappeared from his life that he was worth more than the legacy he was being forced to uphold. Could that woman have been Grace's mother? And if so, what did that mean for the marriage that now bound them together, a union designed to secure a bloodline that might already be tangled in ways he had never imagined? The answers would soon emerge, with consequences that would shake the Blackwood empire to its core. 3 days after her father's revelations, Grace found herself seated in the main study of Blackwood Estate, watching Maxwell pace with uncharacteristic agitation. He had returned from Tokyo earlier than expected, his demeanor noticeably altered. The controlled executive had been replaced by someone visibly struggling to maintain his legendary composure. "You've been investigating my family," he stated flatly, stopping to face her. "Going through private records, questioning staff, inviting your father to discuss matters that fall under strict non-disclosure agreements." Grace met his gaze steadily. "I've been discovering my own history, Maxwell. A history that appears to be intertwined with yours in ways neither of us understood when we married. I received some interesting reports from Tokyo." Maxwell's voice was measured, but tension radiated from him. Medical records from 1994 showing that Margaret Sullivan was indeed pregnant when she left Blackwood. Employment. DNA sequencing indicating that her child, you, share genetic markers with the Blackwood lineage. A chill ran through Grace. "You had my DNA tested without my knowledge?" "Your medical examination upon signing the marriage contract included DNA sampling, a standard procedure for all who enter the Blackwood inner circle." His expression remained unreadable. "The question is why this connection wasn't discovered then." "Perhaps because someone altered the results," Grace suggested. "Someone who knew the truth but wanted this marriage to proceed anyway." Maxwell's jaw tightened. "James? He suggested me to you specifically, didn't he? Arranged our chance meeting at the hospital fundraiser. He must have known about my mother, about the possibility that I'm—" "Not my sister," Maxwell interrupted sharply. "The genetic markers confirm we don't share a father. Elijah Blackwood's DNA is extensively documented in our family records. You are not his biological child." Relief washed over Grace, followed immediately by new questions. "Then who—" "That's what I've been trying to determine." Maxwell unlocked a hidden panel in his desk and removed an old leather journal. "This belonged to my mother, Victoria Blackwood. She disappeared when I was 7, allegedly returning to her family in Europe. I was told she abandoned us because she was weak, unable to handle the pressures of Blackwood responsibilities." He opened the journal carefully. "I found this hidden in her personal items years after she left. My father would have destroyed it had he known it existed. I've kept it all these years, without fully understanding its significance until now." Grace leaned forward as Maxwell placed the journal between them. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, documenting the increasingly oppressive conditions of Victoria's marriage to Elijah Blackwood. "My mother didn't leave voluntarily," Maxwell continued, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "She was forced out after confronting my father about his affairs with household staff. When she threatened to take me with her, he used his political connections to have her declared mentally unstable. She was institutionalized in a private facility under a false name." "That's barbaric," Grace whispered. "It was calculated. My father's concern was never for her well-being, only for the Blackwood reputation and maintaining control of his heir." Maxwell turned several pages forward. The last entry is dated May 1994. She writes about a young nurse who had been kind to her during secret visits. a nurse who had promised to help her establish contact with me once she was released. Grace felt her heart pound. My mother. Margaret Sullivan was apparently assigned to my father's rehabilitation, but discovered my mother's situation through household records. According to this journal, she was helping Victoria prepare legal documents to challenge her false diagnosis. "What happened to your mother?" Grace asked softly. Maxwell's expression hardened. Official records state she suffered a fatal accident at the treatment facility in June 1994. The death certificate is signed by a doctor who I've recently discovered received significant funding from Blackwood Foundations that same year. The implications hung in the air between them. Grace processed the horror of what Maxwell was suggesting. "My mother left Blackwood employment that same month," she said slowly. "She never spoke about her time here, but she had nightmares for years afterward. She would wake up terrified, calling out a name. I always thought she was calling for my father, but perhaps she was calling for Victoria," Maxwell finished. "Your mother knew too much. She was a liability." And now history is repeating itself, Grace realized. James engineered our marriage knowing who I am, perhaps hoping the connection would eventually come to light and create chaos in the Blackwood hierarchy. The prenuptial agreement's strict heir requirements and time limitations ensure that if anything happens to you, or if our marriage fails to produce a child within 12 months, control passes to him. Maxwell's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He checked it, his expression darkening further. "The private investigator I hired has confirmed my suspicions. James has been systematically falsifying company reports for years, diverting funds to shadow accounts. He's also been in regular contact with the board members most loyal to my father's old regime. He's been planning a takeover," Grace concluded, using us as unwitting pawns. "Not just a takeover." Maxwell pulled up a document on his tablet. "This is a medical report dated last week. Blood tests taken during my Tokyo physical show elevated levels of thallium, a tasteless, odorless poison that causes gradual organ failure when administered in small doses over time." Grace gasped. "You're being poisoned. By whom?" "My morning tea is prepared by a personal assistant James recommended 3 months ago." The pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. James had orchestrated a meticulous plan: marry Maxwell to a woman with complicated ties to the Blackwood past, gradually poison him while ensuring Grace couldn't fulfill the heir requirement in time, then step in to save the company while painting Grace as an opportunistic gold digger with mysterious origins. "What do we do?" Grace asked, her nurse's training already calculating treatments for thallium poisoning. Maxwell's expression shifted into something she had never seen before, a cold determination that wasn't the practiced Blackwood mask, but something more personal, more human. "We do what neither of our mothers could do," he said firmly. "We fight back." The next 48 hours unfolded with the precision of a military operation. Maxwell secretly contacted trusted board members, providing evidence of James's financial manipulations. Grace reached out to her father, who connected them with journalists he had treated over the years, professionals with integrity who could be trusted to handle sensitive information appropriately. Together, they crafted a strategy that would expose James without destroying the company or dragging their mother's memories through public scandal. On Monday morning, an emergency board meeting was convened. James arrived confident, having been informed that Maxwell's condition had deteriorated overnight. His smile froze when he entered the boardroom to find Maxwell standing at the head of the table, looking pale but very much in command. "Cousin," James recovered quickly, "I'm relieved to see you up and about. The reports I received were concerning." "I'm sure they were," Maxwell replied evenly. "Please, join us. We were just discussing some interesting financial discrepancies." James's eyes darted around the room, noting the absence of his usual allies on the board. "Minor accounting issues can wait. Your health should be our priority." "My health has been your priority for some time, hasn't it?" Maxwell nodded to his security chief, who distributed folders to each board member. "These documents detail an elaborate embezzlement scheme that has been operating within our company for the past 5 years. The funds have been traced to offshore accounts controlled by James Harrison." This is absurd, James scoffed, though his complexion had paled. Obviously someone has fabricated this evidence, while Maxwell has been incapacitated. The evidence was compiled by 3 independent forensic accounting firms. Grace spoke up from her seat beside Maxwell. Additionally, we have testimony from the assistant you placed in Maxwell's household, the one who has been adding thallium to his tea for the past 3 months. James's facade began to crack. These are outrageous accusations from a woman who has her own questionable background. Did you tell the board about your mother's relationship with Blackwood staff? About your mysterious parentage? I've disclosed everything to the board already, Grace replied calmly, including DNA tests confirming that while I do have Blackwood blood, it isn't through Elijah Blackwood. Then through whom? James demanded, a final attempt to create chaos. Maxwell stepped forward. Through my uncle, Richard Blackwood, your father, James, making Grace your half-sister. The silence in the room was absolute. James stared in genuine shock, his carefully constructed plans disintegrating. That's impossible, he whispered. Richard had an affair with Margaret Sullivan while she worked here, Maxwell continued, his voice steady. A fact your father likely confessed to you at some point, which is how you knew to target Grace specifically. What you didn't anticipate was that we would discover the full truth, that your father also helped Elijah force out my mother, leading to her eventual demise. You weren't just after the company, James. You were covering up your father's complicity in 2 women suffering. Security personnel entered the room, flanking James as Maxwell continued addressing the board. I am hereby exercising my authority as CEO to remove James Harrison from all positions within Blackwood Financial Group, freeze his assets pending criminal investigation, and restructure our corporate governance to prevent such abuses in the future. As James was escorted out, still protesting his innocence, Grace and Maxwell exchanged a look of mutual understanding. This was only the beginning of the changes to come. 3 days later, Grace sat across from Catherine Chen, the most respected investigative journalist in the country. The interview had been carefully negotiated. No cameras, only audio recording, with certain topics clearly designated as off-limits. Mrs. Blackwood, Catherine began, your marriage has been characterized as a strategic alliance from the beginning. Recent events have revealed complex family connections that neither you nor your husband were apparently aware of when you married. Has this changed the nature of your relationship? Grace considered her answer carefully. Our marriage began as a contract, that's true, but contracts can evolve into covenants, promises that go beyond legal obligation to true commitment. We've discovered that we're both survivors of family legacies, built on control rather than care. That shared understanding has created a foundation for something more authentic than either of us anticipated. And the Blackwood Financial Group? Reports suggest massive restructuring is underway. My husband and I believe that any legacy worth preserving must be built on ethical principles. The company is being reorganized around transparency and corporate responsibility. The Blackwood Foundation for Healthcare Justice, which will provide support for patients facing catastrophic medical costs, launches next month. Catherine leaned forward. There are rumors that you're expecting a child. Can you confirm? Grace smiled. Yes. The next generation of Blackwoods will be raised with different values than their predecessors. They'll understand that true strength comes from compassion, not control. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That family means support, not obligation. After the interview, Grace returned to find Maxwell in the estate's library, a room that was gradually being transformed from the dark, imposing space Elijah had created into something warmer and more welcoming. How did it go? He asked, setting aside the architectural plans he'd been reviewing. As well as could be expected, she stayed within the agreed boundaries. Grace settled beside him on the sofa, noticing the changed portrait above the fireplace. You replaced his image. Where Elijah Blackwood's stern portrait had dominated the room for decades, there now hung a newly discovered photograph of Victoria Blackwood, smiling in the estate gardens with a young Maxwell. I found it among my mother's hidden possessions, Maxwell explained. It's the only picture I have of her genuinely happy here. Grace took his hand, feeling the subtle changes in him over the past weeks. The rigid businessman remained, but the shell of emotional detachment had begun to crack, revealing glimpses of the person who might have existed had Elijah's conditioning not been so complete. The contractors presented final plans for the East Wing renovation, Maxwell continued. The Margaret Sullivan Memorial Wing will provide temporary housing for families of long-term hospital patients. Your father has agreed to serve as medical director once he retires from active practice. He's excited about it, Grace confirmed. It honors my mother in a way that would have meant everything to her. Maxwell's hand rested briefly on her abdomen, where their child, now confirmed by medical tests, was growing. I still don't know how to be a father, he admitted quietly. I have no model for what that should look like. Then we'll create a new model, Grace said simply, together. In the months that followed, the transformation of Blackwood Estate mirrored the transformation of its occupants. Walls came down, both literal ones separating wings of the mansion and metaphorical ones between husband and wife. The intimidating security systems remained, but now protected a home rather than a fortress. Maxwell's recovery from the thallium poisoning was gradual but steady. The businessman who had once scheduled every minute of his day with ruthless efficiency now made time for evening walks with his wife, discussing everything from company policy to nursery colors. Grace maintained her nursing credentials, establishing a clinic for underserved communities that operated under Blackwood Foundation funding, but her independent direction. The prenuptial agreement that had once defined their marriage was replaced by a different kind of contract, a public commitment to use the Blackwood resources for genuine social good. On a crisp autumn evening, they stood together on the terrace, overlooking the estate grounds. The setting sun cast long shadows across lawns where generations of Blackwoods had walked before them. My father would call all of this weakness, Maxwell observed, his arm around Grace's expanding waistline. Emotional indulgence that distracts from business objectives. And what would you call it? Grace asked, looking up at him. Maxwell considered, his face softer than it had been when they first met, but still bearing the strength that had enabled him to survive his childhood. I would call it a reclamation, taking back what was stolen from both our mothers, the right to define family on their own terms. The shadows lengthened across the property that had once been a monument to control and was slowly becoming a home. Inside those walls, the next Blackwood heir would be born into a legacy being rewritten by two people who had discovered that true power lay not in domination, but in the courage to break cycles that had persisted for generations. Their story wasn't one of perfect redemption, too much damage had been done for that, but of deliberate reconstruction. Brick by brick, choice by choice, they were building something neither of them had experienced before, a family defined, not by obligation, ambition, or bloodlines, but by the daily decision to see each other fully and choose connection over control. As night fell over Blackwood Estate, the lights within glowed with a warmth that had been absent for decades. The house that had once been filled with whispers and secrets now held the promise of laughter and truth. The legacy that had once been a burden to be carried was becoming a story to be rewritten, not just for themselves, but for the child who would inherit not just a fortune, but the freedom their grandmothers had been denied. Fimda Historia. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by the journey of Grace and Maxwell as they transformed a legacy built on control into one founded on compassion. For more emotionally captivating stories that explore the complexities of family, power, and redemption, we've prepared a special playlist you can find by clicking to your left. If this tale of healing and transformation resonated with you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that delve into the intricate tapestry of human experience. Join us in the comments section below to share your thoughts on the Blackwood legacy. We'd love to hear which moment in this story touched you most deeply. Until our next storytelling adventure, remember that sometimes the most powerful legacy is the one we choose to rewrite.